Richard Silverstein, Dr. Richard Silverstein, is with us. He has a PhD in neuroscience. He's the founding director of the Brain Sciences Institute at Swinburne University in Melbourne, Australia, a lab which, by the way, invented steady-state topography, one of the really fancy, sophisticated ways of figuring out what's going on inside a person's brain in real time as they're doing everything from watching an advertisement to thinking. And Dr. Silverstein, Richard, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, Tom.
And welcome to the United States. It's great to have you here with us, and it's great to have you as a house guest.
The pleasure's mine.
Yeah. You have done some astounding research. Back 5-6 years ago, you were doing research on attention deficit hyperactive disorder, and you identified that there was a unique difference in the way that brains of ADHD kids versus non-ADHD kids worked as a starting point.
That's right. What we were looking at was the way that different parts of the brain talk to each other when people had undertook thinking tasks. And what we found was that the control group of children, which were boys in this case, their patterns of brain activity were quite different to the ADHD group. The ADHD group showed increased communication between the back of the brain and the front of the brain, and we just didn't see that in the control group, and
right.
we were very surprised. And I remember discussing this one with you, Tom.
Yeah, we were sitting in Vermont in our dining room, our dining room table, as you were showing me these graphs, and the thought that immediately came to my mind was the back of the brain is the occipital regions, and the parietal regions is where we store visual memory in particular, and an awful lot of data. There's a lot of data stored back there. Why would it be that ADHD kids, when they're supposed to be focusing on what the teacher's saying, instead are accessing all this data? And could that lead to something else? Could that be something else?
That's precisely the point. And in fact, it was probably one of the main aha moments in my life when you said, say, Richard, do you think that could be something to do with creativity? Because while most of my research has been on ADHD and looking at it as a pathology, which is the traditional way that it's looked at, there is a lot of evidence that a very high proportion of entrepreneurs, innovators, and inventors would have been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD had those labels been around at the time. Edison is an obvious one, Leonardo da Vinci, Einstein, Virginia Woolf, the list goes on and on. And it's increasingly recognized now. And there's a reconceptualization about the way we're thinking about ADHD. Is it just a pathology, or is it, in fact, have we pathologized a way of thinking, a way of looking at the world? And that's what the data started to suggest to me.
So you then went back and you took people who had nothing to do with ADHD at all, but had taken a test to measure whether or not they were creative, a whole spectrum of people from not particularly creative, very highly creative, and you put them in this steady-state topography machine that you have developed to monitor brain activity with over 2,000 different parts of the brain connected to each other. And you can create these beautiful visual models of what's going on inside their brain in real time, microsecond to microsecond. And you compared the brains of creative people to kids with ADHD. And the result that you have come up with now, and this, by the way, is being announced because you're in the process of preparing this for publication.
That's precisely
this is being announced in the United States for the first time on this radio show.
That's right. That's right. What was staggering to me was that particular pattern. In fact, the pattern that you suggested, could that have anything to do with creativity, led me, as you said, to that other research project looking at people who weren't diagnosed with ADHD, but who we could measure the level of creativity. There's a test to measure creativity. It's not a very good one, but it's the best one we've got. And what we looked at was, is there a relationship between this measure of creativity and how this pattern of brain connectivity occurs in just the ordinary people? And what we found was this: the more creative they were, the stronger was that very pattern we saw in the ADHD group, which is the back of the brain, the parietal occipital region, talking to the frontal region. And I must admit, that was really one of the most exciting moments I've had for a long time, because seeing that pattern so clearly suddenly made a lot of sense. And, of course, Tom, you've been saying that for longer than just about anybody else. In fact, I think you're the first one to have actually made it a clear point, indicating that, in fact, ADHD, we may need to rethink what ADHD is. I'm not talking about the extreme, severely pathological cases, but it may be just a normal part of our thinking style is being pathologized.
Right. Yeah, I posited that in 1992.
That's right.
And actually in 1980 was the first published piece I had within the Journal of Orthomolecular Psychiatry, that they're just hunters in a farmer's world. Thank you for the acknowledgement. By the way, I'm honored.
Overdue, I'd say.
Thank you. We're talking with Dr. Richard Silverstein. He is the founder and director of the Brain Sciences Institute, a neuroscientist at Swinburne University in Melbourne, Australia, the inventor, or his lab invented, steady-state topography. One of the leading brain scientists in the world. You present at conferences literally all over the world on a regular basis, and in fact, you're doing so right now. You're on a tour around the world as we speak. Where are you going?
This time will be Cincinnati and New York.
Great. Yeah. And so you're suggesting that, Richard, that we are pathologizing. By pathology, making into a sickness, something that might be a normal way of thinking, and that ADHD may actually be the same, or actually, according to your evidence, the same type of brain pattern activity that you see in diagnosed ADHD kids is the same as with highly creative individuals. What happens when you give highly ADHD kids Ritalin to shut down their ADHD behavior? Does their brain still behave in the way that a creative person does?
The pattern changes. I think what we require here are really two ways of thinking. If you will, there's the very focused, what's called convergent thinking, where you're able to maintain attention for a long period of time on a few facts. But at the same time, there is another way of thinking, the more divergent, the ability to see links between facts that maybe other people haven't seen. And the patterns of brain activity that correspond to those two ways of thinking vary. When you're in much more the convergent thinking style, focused, etc., different regions of the brain tend to operate more independently of each other. They don't talk so much with different regions. On the other hand, when you need to link ideas, that's when, in fact, there's more communication between these different regions of the brain. Right. So normally all of us have both capacities, but the more creative individuals tend to have this capacity to link up more easily. And it seems to be that the pattern of ADD symptoms, so-called, associated quite often with high intelligence, are the keynotes that we see in highly creative individuals throughout the ages.
And what happens when you medicate them?
Well,
do they lose their access to that creativity?
Well, what they subjectively sense is that they're able to focus much better and maintain their attention. But in fact, the ability to suddenly see those relationships, which sometimes actually occurs almost unconsciously. You're walking along and suddenly, that experience. Those sorts of things tend to happen much less. But on the other hand, your capacity to access information that you've already got, not new relationships, what you've already got, is probably improved by medication.
Right.
So
you're better at taking tests, you're better at being a bookkeeper, but if you're going to invent the thing that's going to save the world, forget it if you're on medication. If Ben Franklin and Thomas Edison, who I think we can both agree were classic cases of ADHD, if they had been on Ritalin through their childhood, there would probably be no United States of America and no electric light bulb. Is that a reasonable statement, or am I being hyperbolic?
No, that's a very interesting extrapolation. To what extent they had intrinsic creativity, which would have, in a sense, compensated for some of the medication, is a very moot question. I suspect if they were heavily medicated, your point would be exactly correct.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, let's acknowledge, and you're in this business, there are some kids who are tremendously helped by this medication, and the side effects of failure in our public schools are, in my opinion, frankly, worse than, in many cases, than the side effects of the medication.
I think that's a very important point.
So let's change our schools.
Well, yes, exactly. The other point I think that I should point out is that if you're talking about the extreme end of the pathological, of the spectrum, then there is real disability, and in some cases medication may be of use, but there are other ways, in fact, of addressing this rather than medication. Techniques such as neurotherapy, for example, and also some of the nutritional supplementation, particularly the omega-3 fatty acids, are of enormous importance.
Fish oil.
Yep. That's it.
And fish oil is actually useful in mood regulation, in increasing creativity, and decreasing ADHD symptoms.
That's right. That's right. It increases the capacity of the brain to release all sorts of neurotransmitters.
Yeah, remarkable. Remarkable. Dr. Richard Silverstein with us. We'll take your calls on this topic. Your thoughts on, are we medicating an entire generation of children into the inability to create the things that will save us and save the world? Could it be? 866-987-TOM.